Thank you all. Thanks for coming this evening. And it's a delight to be able to have the honor of introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. Joanna Lambert. Dr. Lambert is a professor of wildlife ecology and the director of the American Canid Project at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Dr. Lambert is a rare individual who seamlessly blends the unquenchable curiosity for the natural world with a shrewd application of the scientific process and an unceasing effort to apply what she learns in the service of conservation worldwide, all while fostering the next generation of scientists. When working in Yellowstone, I've had the chance to follow Dr. Lambert in the field, and I say follow because her boundless energy in wading through knee-deep snow, fording icy rivers, leaves a lot of us in the snowdrifts behind her. Some of you, I think, also here know fieldwork well, and you even might be wondering, those of others, how do you maintain such energy to do the things that Dr. Lambert does? And I'll elaborate more in a bit. You know that it's a very specific diet regimen, usually involving things like pizza, beer, and cheese. Dr. Lambert has worked for many years, 40 years, and has covered, as John said, all the continents of the globe. And she has focused her work largely over the last 4 decades on equatorial Africa, where she has studied primates and elephants, and here in North America, where her work has been focused on canines, specifically coyotes, and the subject of tonight's program, gray wolves. Dr. Lambert is highly respected among her academic peers and has been the author and co-author on hundreds, literally hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific papers, reports, bulletins, monographs, and book chapters, and of course, several books as well. Her most recent book, entitled How Primates Eat, a synthesis of nutritional ecology across the mammal order, was just published this fall with the University of Chicago Press. She is an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She is a fellow of the Explorers Club, a member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Species Survival Commission. She serves as a consultant for the United Nations Environmental Program and has been inducted into the prestigious Linnaean Society in London. That is the very same one in which Charles Darwin himself was a member, and where he first presented his theory of evolution by natural selection. She sits on the board of numerous conservation nonprofits, including the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, where one of her proudest recent accomplishments was paving the way for the reintroduction of gray wolves to Colorado. She is beloved by her students and has instructed over 10,000 undergraduates during her career, mentored in various capacities 30 PhD students, 20 master's degree students, and many honors project students as well. And like those students, I'm sure you're going to enjoy what she has to share tonight. Her lecture, Gray Wolves and Humans in Deep Time, Recent History and Now. And it's at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Joanna Lambert. Joanna?
Hi, Livingston. Here I am. I promise I won't have him on stage the whole time. I'm now officially one of those women that carries their dog everywhere. I've only had him about 6 weeks. The relevance of having him up on stage is that I got him from an animal shelter in Boulder, Colorado, and I immediately brought him to Montana, and he is now currently finding his inner wolf. And is very excited to be here. But thank you for indulging me. He's the perfect prop. I'm now going to hand him off, you little guy. Anyway, thank you, George. Where did you go, George? There you are. Thank you for your comments. And thank you, John. Thank you, Gateway Museum. Thank you to all of you for being here. I'm delighted to be here. There are familiar faces here. I have not spoken in Livingston. I'm very proud and feel privileged to be here, and especially in the beautiful Shane Center. I'm loaded for bear, by the way. I've got some serious wiring going on. If I don't trip over all this wiring, it'll be quite a miracle. And it is true. So I I eat appallingly. And I think George just mentioned that. And it's ironic because, in fact, I do spend a lot of my time thinking about the evolution of diet. My current work actually is interpreting a lot of animal behavior, including canids, through the lens of diet and the evolution of diet and nutritional ecology. I'm not going to be talking about that today. I did give a talk a couple of weeks ago at the Museum of the Rockies in which I really sort of honed in on a lot of the research I am doing in the park and in the American West. Today, what I thought I would do is give a big picture kind of assessment of this complicated relationship that we have with Canis lupus, gray wolves, right? I have no doubt that the vast majority of you in this room have had the privilege of seeing gray wolves in the wild, and we are indeed privileged to have these extraordinary observational circumstances here at Yellowstone to watch wolves. And there's, generally speaking, a favorable disposition to them. But as you all well know, it's not fully favorable, right? And what I want to do today, then, is to explore where this comes from, right? And I've got a lot of ground to cover, man. I've got to go through 1,000,000 years of evolutionary history, so bear with me and hold on. So here we go. So just big picture, right? Just to situate all of what we talk about so that it's not just about gray wolves, Canis lupus, and Homo sapien. In fact, we share this extraordinary planet with well over 65,000 vertebrate species, untold numbers of invertebrates, right? And of the more familiar species, those within the order, class Mammalia, we have about 6,400 species. I've had the extraordinary experience and privilege of having worked with a number of extremely charismatic mammal species over my career of 40-ish years as a field biologist. And in fact, that is how I just sort of distinguish myself. I'm not a wolf biologist. I get sort of imposter syndrome if anybody thinks or calls me that, because I'm not. I would dub myself an evolutionary ecologist, someone that's happiest in the field, running around after animals and working in the trenches of conservation biology in many, many ways around the world. I focus in on endangered mammal species, especially, as George noted, and John, I think, as well, primates and carnivores, and also elephants. And what I've been doing over the past few years, decade or so, is focusing my research attention on changing behavior in animal species as they are coping with all that we have wrought on this planet in terms of anthropogenic change. And so specifically, I've been looking at behaviors in coyotes and in gray wolves as they enter into human-dominated landscapes. And why I'm bringing this up at the outset is because I've been doing this long enough in a period on our Earth's history of extraordinarily rapid change, right? And I've been doing this long enough that I have been observing dramatic shifts in the behaviors of my study subjects as they attempt to cope with what we're up to. But I would say that despite all of the species that I've worked with, it is this species right here that brings up most affective, most emotional response in humans. And I say this, despite the fact that these species right here are vastly more responsible for the deaths of various, livestock and humans around the world, and crop raiding, right? And so but it's this species, gray wolves, right, that when I bring up Canis lupus, and this is in the northern hemisphere, not so much sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere, I get immediate response of an emotional sort, right, in a very different way than I do with, say, tiger or chimps or what have you. And this has brought me to, as an evolutionary ecologist, deeply into this world of trying to figure out the underpinnings of this, because that's what I like to do as an evolutionary ecologist. And I am also saying this from the perspective of someone that has been doing this and observing these kinds of dramatic results and responses in many sectors, including teaching. So I teach a course called Dogs, Wolves, and Human Evolution, and invariably CBS News or ABC News hears that I'm teaching it, comes out to my classroom and wants to film it. It makes headlines because it's got gray wolves, or not gray wolves, but wolves in the subject, in the title of the course, right? I know this from a lot of the work that I have been doing in the American West, which is not just basic science of field biology and lab work, but also involves, and yes, this is me with the postal thing, also me working in working landscapes, in rural landscapes, with folks who are getting impacted by gray wolves. And so those emotions come up there. It also has come up in a recent conservation initiative that I have been in the heart of, and that is the reintroduction of wolves into Colorado. I won't spend too much time right now talking about it, as I will bring this up at the end, right? But suffice it to say that all of these sectors, all of these realms, and pretty much anyone that knows me knows that all I do is this work, right? So I am deeply embedded in this stuff, that these realms have revealed diverse, what I would call very deeply seated and dissonant attitudes towards wolves. And this is what I want to explore, because it not only influences this dissonance, this vitriol, in many cases, this vehemence against them or for them. It not only influences human quality of life, right, especially by folks that are fearful of them, right? It is also impacting our ability to implement conservation action, right? So this is not just an academic enterprise. This is not just an academic query, right? It influences how we are getting things done. So tonight I want to explore the origins of this. And more specifically, what I'd like to do is first unfold humans and the relationships of humans and wolves in deep time and in recent history. I'd like to explain ecological interactions as an ecologist, as a trained ecologist. We'll go through some of that between these two species, and then illustrate the consequences of these deep-seated, dissonant, diverse attitudes for humans and wolves today. Right? So this is the big picture. I'll start with that first point right off the bat, and I'm going to flash an image of this remarkable landscape. This is actually a photograph that I took. This is not actually Beringia sense in the strictest sense. It's as close to Beringia as you can get at high latitudes. And it depicts sort of this open kind of landscape of high tundra, right? Windswept high tundra at very high latitudes. It's relevant because of the significance of faunal exchange between Eurasia, the Eurasian continent, and the North American continent, and also for the evolutionary history, not only of our own species, but of gray wolves. And so what you're looking at here, of course, is the North American continent, the Eurasian continent, and then those two arrows depicting what would have been a land bridge, or something that has been called sort of a region known as Beringia. It's no longer there, right? Seas are higher now. But in many important times in evolutionary history, this has been a bridge for the exchange, and that has facilitated exchange. I bring it up because our oldest Canis lupus fossil hail from this region of Beringia, just either side of what would have been a land bridge, right? So the oldest one showing up at a little over 1 million years ago in the eastern portion of Siberia, and then on the North American side, rough sort of plus minus brackets around the fossil dating of an unequivocal Canis lupus skull at between 800,000 and 1 million years ago. And so from this, right, from this sort of area betwixt and around North America and Eurasia of the Bering Straits, we get dispersion of Canis lupus throughout the northern hemisphere. And so what I'm showing you there on this side here, the right side, is the movement of gray wolves pushing into Eastern Eurasia, what we now call Europe, of course, arriving and fairly well established by about 400,000 years ago. And then over on the other side, coming out of that Beringia region, making their way down through North America between, say, 100 and 300,000 years, right? So meanwhile, we've got our own little baby species, right? And I mean baby because we've only been around for about 200. The best sort of consolidated genetic and fossil perspective on our own evolutionary history is about 200,000 years. Sub-Saharan regions of the continent of Africa, lots of movements. I mean, huge, array of migrations of various hominin species out of Africa, but our own anatomically modern Homo sapien, our own species, pushing into different regions of Eurasia between about 30 and 70,000 years ago. After a few sort of truncated false starts of our species, we eventually began to populate. And then, of course, and this is when I start getting really conscious of the fact that Dr. Scott Dersham is sitting in the audience, so please bear with me on this part, okay? So pushing into the North American continent by about 18 to 20,000 years on that eastern portion of Siberia over down into the westernmost portions of the continent. So if you're paying attention to dates, right, what this suggests is that gray wolves were abundant in Europe or Eurasia by about 400,000 years ago, and in North America by about 100,000 years, right? Humans arrived to Eurasia by whatever, plus or minus 30 to 70,000, depending on the region of that continent, and into North America between 12 and 19,000. So the upshot of this, the implication is we have a very long and deep history of sympatry, of overlap, of sharing landscapes with gray wolves. This is not a new thing, right? We have shared landscapes with gray wolves throughout our entire evolutionary history in the northern hemisphere, which is a big deal, right? So I want to add some really important context to thinking about humans and wolves in deep time. And the first part, significant part of this context is the overlapping prey resources, right? That gray wolves, or wolves in general, there are many wolf species, and that's a whole other topic for another time, but we'll stick with gray wolves for now, and Homo sapien, right? Homo sapien being a really, really good big game hunter, a modern Homo, having throwing devices to bring down big prey. And there was a lot of overlap with woolly mammoth, with a whole array of horse species, with auroch, and of course we know, beautifully enough, what humans were eating. At least we understand what was symbolically meaningful to humans, and then archaeologically, right, from cut marks and things, similar prey base. The other piece that is really significant, going back in time, thinking about humans and wolves and the same landscape of Pleistocene, Northern Hemisphere in the Pleistocene epoch, is that while we indeed have an amazing assemblage of predators here in Yellowstone Park, it is nothing compared to what it was, right? The predator, so-called predator guild, the assemblage of predators up until, say, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12,000 years ago, depending on where you were, was very much more fierce, for want of a better word. This is work from the remarkable Blair van Valkenburg, paleontologist at UCLA. We know that Pleistocene predators and humans that were sharing landscapes, that the Pleistocene predator communities or assemblages, they were very many more species There were more individuals of those species, so they were more abundant, and they were a lot bigger. On average, a lot bigger. So what you're looking at here, this pretty straightforward histogram here. I've got down at the bottom the late Pleistocene of the New World, say North America, right? And Yellowstone National Park. And what I'm indicating here is the total number of carnivores, right? With the, up until the late Pleistocene, vastly more of those predators. So it was there was overlapping prey. There was a lot of predators around, and this, bear with me. This is so like, I had to do this. I'm all into ChatGPT image building now. And I put in some Google search terms, not Google search terms, ChatGPT terms. I was like, Homo sapien, predator guild, Pleistocene. What are you going to come up with? And I just had to show you this. Like this, is that like an apatosaurus? Like what is that? And then like a dragon, and then a wolf with saber teeth. I mean, anyway, lest you were thinking that I was exaggerating how fierce the Predator Guild was, we got this. Anyway, another piece of really important context for thinking about humans and wolves, and I would argue, hence that little thing right there, dog domestication. Dog domestication I could talk ad nauseum about, I won't. Suffice it to say that it took place began the whole process vastly longer ago than all other domestication events associated with humans, right? And we've got some, actually fairly reasonable artist reconstructions here, and I can talk a lot about this, I won't, but just so that you know, just big picture, because I'm going to talk a lot about this because it adds, I believe, really meaningfully to our complicated relationships with wolves now, that both species benefited from having the other around in many ways. Not all, but the scenario that is beginning to be unfolded is that somewhere around 30 to 40,000 years ago, as our species entered into the realm of where gray wolves were, some, not clearly not all, but some of those gray wolves overcame their fear of humans to take advantage of a new food resource, not humans as the new food resource, but in terms of scavenging the meat from these shared prey sources and the kill sites, right? I could talk about self-domestication, I won't, but this is what is thought of as the beginning of a self-domestication process. And then the mutualism here, the benefit, is that while wolves are getting food and, there's humans around, humans quickly, you learn the utilities of having wolves around for predator protection against all of those fierce predators that would have been around, right? Again, I could talk a lot about this, I won't. Some key scholars here who have written some beautiful things, but kind of have that in your mind, okay? Deep time. I now am going to enter more into recent history, and again, I'm super conscious of the archaeologists in the crowd, but there you go. The Neolithic Revolution, when everything changed on Earth with regards to our relationship with the wild world, how we get energy from food, and how we make a living, right? Settle down, right? Start domesticating our own food. We have surplus food. This means we don't have to move anymore. So now we have to start building fences and walls to keep stuff out that we don't want eating our livestock or our crops, right? So this, of course, is the advent of the Neolithic Revolution, the so-called Holocene epoch. So we've now moved out of the Pleistocene. And to me, it is really meaningful to think about the fact that this would have been the first time in our evolutionary history, or history at all, ever, that the distinction between wild versus not wild animals would have come into being, right? And that this would also have been about the first time that humans started further categorizing when it comes to those things we kill, those animals we kill, that there are some animals we kill because we want to eat them, and then other animals we kill because we don't want those animals to eat the things that we want to eat. So massively, just this new array of cognitive sort of categories for things that we don't want around, right? And so we would have seen then the beginning of predator control at about this time that was extremely effective in Eurasia, and especially I'll just pull it now to Western Europe, where we have the best records of this. Brown bear, lynx, gray wolves, all gone. 15th, 16th, 17th century, right? And so if we think about, again, pushing through deep into more recent time, predator control and its arrival to the North American continent, it's pretty new, relatively, right? Landing 400-ish years ago, pushing out with manifest destiny as white colonial settlers after they landed on the continent, bringing over that predator control ethic, and through manifest destiny, doing a superb job basically killing everything, right? And what we know, and Dan Flores talked about this in his talk, the first in this series, of course, is that what went on here was vastly more intense and more effective than it had been in Europe. And what took place over thousands of years, right, in parts of Eurasia, took place in just a few hundred here, with extreme consequences, as we all know. So what this is all depicting, right, is that the evolutionary, deep time, and more recent written history is revealing an array of relationships, right? What we would call, as ecologists, ecological relationships. And that I would suggest that it is the total array of these ecological interactions that yields this dissonance, right? And so now what I want to do, and bear with me, I put on a little bit of a professor hat. I teach these ecology courses. I want to just go through what I mean by ecological interactions, because I think this is really important because it is so inherent to every single species that we are engaged in interactions with other species, right? It literally influences our wiring, our neurology, right, and our behavior. And so just, again, bear with me. We don't need to get into the fancy words here. But if you read a good old Principles of Ecology textbook, you will read that there are only so many ways that species can interact, right? If you define those interactions as being either negative to one of the species or neutral to the species, or positive, or beneficial, right? And so you can come up with these pluses and minuses of, so in competition, neither species benefits. It's not it's not beneficial to have another species around that uses all the same resources, for example, right? Whereas a mutualism, right? Classic mutualisms, pollinating insects and their flowers, right? Mutualisms, it's very beneficial to have that other species around. Well, if you go through all of the evolutionary history of our species with Canis lupus, we have engaged and continue to engage in almost all of these. Well, no, all of them. And if there's someone in this audience who is an ecologist, paleontologist, whatever, and I mean this sincerely, that can come up with another example of a species and say, let's stick with a predator, that meets all of this, let's talk, because I would love to just brainstorm on that. But as in my sort of thinking about this, there is no other species that we have this with, right? And so what do I mean by this? So competition, I already talked about the same prey. We have the same prey now, right? You hear about elk, right? Hear about white-tailed deer, moose, right? Back then and now. Scavenging at kill sites, not so much now, but absolutely this parasitic relationship in deep time of wolves taking prey or taking from kill sites. Predation, this would have happened both ways, right? A predator-prey interaction of sometimes humans having to kill wolves for whatever reason, and wolves sometimes having to kill humans, right, under certain circumstances. And I'm talking about over the, tens of thousands of years, certainly not recently, right? But this, to me, is where I think it gets really interesting, where the twist comes in. Because we could say those negative things about a lot of predators or a lot of species, right? But add those negative ones and then start playing around with things like commensalism. So in evolutionary history, and I swear, even today, we take advantage, George could talk all about this, of listening in on what other animals are doing. And if we hear other animal species detect something, we pay attention, right? So the increased predator detection of having another really vigilant sentinel species around, right? But then we have this bit. The true mutualism, right? So in many cases, I would argue, the domestication of auroch into cattle, right? Domestication of some ovis species into sheep, that wasn't a mutualism. Those cattle and sheep weren't benefiting, right? They weren't approaching humans to get something out of the equation, right? This mutualistic relationship is what I think gives the twist on all of this, with especially cooperative hunting. And again, I don't have the time to get into that, but we certainly can. And now, Canis lupus familiaris, companion animals. And they and they don't need to be ridiculous 4.5-pound Pomeranians to be a companion animal, right? We know, for example, from the archaeological record that some of these early proto-dog, almost basically wolf, were very symbolically meaningful, right? Buried with woolly mammoth bones, actual burial sites, right? Suggesting this kind of companion-like relationship. So if we want to go through those ecological interactions, it runs the gamut, right? And again, as I've mentioned, I believe this is at the heart of what may be going on with this dissonance that many, many folks feel about wolves. And we'll just call them Canis lupus. Domesticated dogs are the same genus and the same species, right? So anyway, diverse, deep-seated, dissonant attitudes in deep time, when we had a whole array of kinds of interactions in recent history, and now, right? And so some of these images will be familiar to you. Norm Bishop, I don't know if he's here, this is a photograph that Norm took when he was still with NPS, of course, when wolves were coming into Yellowstone, right? And as you know, many of you lived this, the attitudes ran the gamut. And it was the world's attention was on what was going to happen if wolves were going to go in and once wolves were in, right? And I can now say this, I wasn't around, I was somewhere in Congo when all that was going on, but I have been in the thick of Colorado wolf reintroduction, and it's the same thing all over again, right? So now, in the latter portion of this talk, what I want to do is suggest and kind of flesh out some of the consequences of this dissonance, of these diverse attitudes for humans and wolves today. And first, I want to briefly touch on what happens when you take out apex predators. Many of you know this, and some of you may not so much. What happens to conservation action amidst a lot of diverse attitudes, especially fear, right? And then this twist, right, at the end, which again, this is just a working hypothesis, so I'm still developing a lot of this stuff. But let's talk about what happens when you take out an entire portion of a food web, right? And that's, for all intents and purposes, what we did for several hundred years with, a federally mandated predator control policy that got rid of not just gray wolves, as you know, but most of our predators. And these are various images of the various, the things that arise in the absence of apex predators: massive overgrazing, herbivore abundance exploding as a consequence of, like what happens when we just transform entire landscapes with our own domiciles, right? And then when we replace native prey species with slow-moving domesticated species like these Hereford cattle here, right? So again, this could be, several hours unto itself, but suffice it to say that the ecological and sociocultural consequences of removing apex predators has been extraordinary, right? And lasting, and arguably there have been massive tipping points, so that regardless of whether you put them back or not, you can't go back whence you came, right? Even if you do now put them back, those systems do not, they've undergone kind of a phase shift, right? So anyway, altered food webs, overabundance of prey species, overgrazing, some of the more well-known ones. Other issues such as shifts in disease transmission and pathogens amongst herbivores and other species. Sociocultural consequences, lost traditions of indigenous populations, human populations of this continent, right, just erased. And then many generations now of folks living in landscapes without predators. So there's been this complete loss of knowledge of how to do it, right? People have begun to figure it out here because it's 30 years down the line. In Colorado, not so much. There is active learning and teaching going on right now on the Western Slope to bring folks back up to, sort of an understanding of how to live in a landscape with predators, right? And so I want to take that. I could go on and on about that. I won't. I want to shift to talk about conservation action, because this is, I'm impatient with just basic science and questions just for question's sake. At my age, I want to. It's meaningful to me to think about how this is getting played out on Earth, right? In terms of conservation action and what we can do, because the reality is, and we know this from a massive UN report that came out in 2019. 1,400 plus scientists at the IUCN evaluating all the data. We're about to lose about 1 million species, right, in the next decade or two, unless massive change goes on, right? And this is why I don't sleep well at night, because even some of the species that I have studied, say in Africa and Asia and elsewhere, that were at reasonably healthy populations when they first started, are dwindling, right? I don't spend too much in the doom and gloom because there's too much work to do, and we can't let all those numbers paralyze us, right? So that's why I like to think about action. And this past year, not 24, but 23, was significant, of course, because 50th anniversary of arguably the most important legislation there is on Earth for protecting endangered species, and that would be the Endangered Species Act. And then increasingly action in the form of rewilding, which is just this buzz term, right, for relocation or reintroduction of species back to a place where they have been removed. And of course that took place here in 95 and 96, took place in Colorado just last year, right? So I bring these two up because both the ESA and this idea of rewilding, right? Canis lupus figures prominently, right? Gray wolves were one of the first species, literally within the first week of Nixon signing that act. Gray wolves were put on the Federal Registry of Endangered Species. They've been there ever since. Of course, they've been delisted in the Northern Rockies, but elsewhere still on the listed. And what you're looking at here, this absolutely iconic image of, Secretary of Interior, Director of Fish and Wildlife, lead wolf biologist at the time in '95, Mike Phillips, bringing wolves in. This is a shot, I think this is a shot, Soda Butte Pen, not Rose Creek. But anyway, and then this shot here. This was December of 2023. This is wolves being let back into Colorado after many, many decades not being around. And this is where all that dissonance comes up, and what went down both in the GYE and in Colorado before, during, and after reintroduction is the legacy, this lag time, or no, not so much lag time, but inertia, I should say, of all of this, sort of complicated attitudes and stuff that we have with regards to thinking about gray wolves, right? Because it has absolutely influenced, and I can say this right now in real time, how it was different here in the MPS, with the MPS, because it was the federal government. Is some interesting idiosyncrasies with what is going on in Colorado, which I could talk about. But getting back to the significance of wolves and rewilding and where we're at, the Yellowstone reintroduction to science and what all was learned here, which was arguably one of the most important conservation success stories we have, right? And now it is like textbook on, trophic cascades, all this stuff. Literally, I teach this stuff now to undergrads, right? The science of the reintroduction and all of that went down led to what we did in Colorado, again with Mike Phillips at the helm. I wish Mike were here. He's not here. He's a dear colleague. And I call out to Mike of all the work that he did there. It was his vision to get wolves back into Colorado. For many years in the 90s, Rob Edward was critical in this. And we ran it, and now I'll just get into this a little bit, just a couple slides. We ran it like a campaign. We had campaign managers. We had yard signs. We had signatures. I did, as it turned out, I did the advertisements. I was like the vote yes on Proposition 114 commercial person. And then 10 wolves were released into Western Colorado about a year ago, right? Give or take about a week or a couple weeks or so. I had the extraordinary privilege of being there. It was something I never thought I would be witness to. I was standing roughly like here, like right there. I promise I was there. Yeah. Anyway. But again, with the reaction and the dissonance and the array of attitudes, right? As soon as the Secretary of State signed off on the signatures that we had arrived at for the citizen-led ballot initiative, this was not the federal government. This was the result of a democratic process. This is a result of Mike having moved on from the MPS into becoming a elected public official, had the vision of taking this to a vote, and as soon as it was apparent that it was going to go to a vote, shit the fan, right? And it was, again, same old, all that inertia of attitudes that immediately hit the press and hit every aspect, every sector of this important rewilding that we were attempting to do on public lands of Western Colorado, right? And so, great, and yet we have dogs, right? And I guess this is, I don't know what time it is at all. I'm actually timely. I'm going to end on this because, and the reason why I'm ending on this is because I don't have an answer to all of this. This is one of those, this is an example of what we do as evolutionary biologists, as archaeologists, as historians. We can only look back, right? And learn from what has happened. It's not that there's necessarily any answer to this, right? What I'm attempting to do is invoke some compassion for all of the array of attitudes that folks have towards wolves. Because there are some folks that are absolutely in a relationship that is competition. When you're an outfitter and you're going for elk and you can't find elk because there's a pack of wolves, and so you lose your livelihood, you're in a competitive interaction, right? If you are someone that loves watching wolves, it's a commensal relationship. Those wolves in Yellowstone Park don't care if you're watching, well, they might, but they're ignoring you mostly, watching them. But you, as a tourist, are getting extraordinary, sort of benefit from that. We are still engaged in this. And then this part, I think, again, is kind of the icing on the cake of why all of this is so complicated for humans and why no human can easily identify exactly why they either love or hate wolves. Because we have these guys right here, right? And the reality of this is that if anybody ever, and I bet most of you are dog lovers, if anybody ever says, oh, it's just a dog, okay, so it's absolutely influenced our evolutionary history. The way that we're able to communicate interspecifically with that dog we now know that there are neural underpinnings and it influences our physiology. There's no such thing as, oh, it's just a dog. We have been interacting with Canis lupus either as wolf or proto-dog or dog form for 30,000+ years. It is exceptionally meaningful. It has arguably influenced the way that we have captured resources on the land. And in fact, not even arguably, it is, right? People today still use dogs to capture resources that they eat, right? Using Canis lupus familiaris. So combined weight of dogs on Earth, right, and I've got them circled here, and cats are in there as well just because this is the stat I got here, is comparable to the weight of all wild mammals. So the two low on that histogram there, they're the two bottom ones, right? Dogs and cats and wild mammals. And you can see it's our cattle, right, or our livestock and humans that make up the vast majority of mammalian biomass on Earth, right? It is a $166 billion industry in the United States alone, right? We don't even know how many dogs are on Earth. Some estimates are, the best I can come up with is over 1 billion. Easily 80 million dogs in the United States alone, right? Over 400 recognized breeds. It is incredibly significant, right? And I believe that it is what is adding fuel to the dissonance of how to deal with Canis lupus, because the irony is we use Canis lupus to help us with our cattle, right? We use Canis lupus and I'll talk about guardian dogs in a second. Hunters will use Canis lupus to hunt Canis lupus. That's the shot from Wisconsin a few years ago, right? Hunters will use dogs in any array, a multiple array, or hunting tactics. And hunters for hunters are saying that we should kill wolves because they can kill domesticated wolves. And so, I'm not saying that like to be like, this isn't me like pointing fingers. This is me trying to unfurl the complexity of this, right? Like, and truly, like if, you know, in the 1950s, this term cognitive dissonance was first operationally defined, and it's when there are opposing concepts cognitively, and you don't have a way of integrating or making sense of them. And that's why I'm saying there isn't necessarily an answer, right? It's an explanation based on what we have observed. The good news is that what we know from the Yellowstone reintroduction, and I'm holding on to this as I'm grabbing a hold of the side of the dinghy in the hurricane of reintroduction of wolves into Colorado. The good news is that we know that with time and compassion and increased knowledge and habituation, that this can diffuse, begin to kind of mitigate and soften, right, blur some of that vitriol and some of that diverse, dissonant attitudes. And also, this is kind of this cool thing, dogs, Canis lupus familiaris, are part of the answer, right? They can be and are a very meaningful part of our strategy, not only in terms of ethical hunting, right, but also in terms of protecting our livestock. And I've got this image here, and I just call out if anybody has questions about livestock guardian dogs. My dear friend and colleague and project manager, Christina Gaylor, is sitting in the front row, worked for many years in Central Europe with livestock guardian dogs and also in North America, and is now holding my livestock guardian dog. Just kidding. Anyway, Christina can do a fabulous job with responding to that. So I will end on that note. I told you that Dandelion is finding his inner wolf. I live right on the border of Yellowstone Park. I have a little cabin down there in Gardner, and yeah, I have a bunch of things. I could see this happens to you when you get a little dog like that. So anyway, I'll stop there. I want to thank innumerable people in all of my work. It's not a solo enterprise. I especially want to call out the collegiality and friendship of Mike Phillips and my colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, and also Christina Gaylor, plus innumerable other colleagues and friends, my funders, and thank you. That's what I got.